Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm joined today by a serial entrepreneur named Avi Yashchin, who I've known for many years now, and he's just started a company in the last couple of years called Subconscious AI. We're going to dig into what he's doing there, but before we do any of that, Avi, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I feel like we almost had you on many years ago when Westworld was just starting, and we were talking about doing a spinoff of Trending in Ed based on Westworld, which is staying true to your AI bona fides. But I think we held off on shipping it. So you have never officially aired. Now you're here, which is awesome. And we always start by letting you tell your story. Let us know who you are and how you got to this point in your professional life.
Oh, man. I started my career on Wall Street, of all places, and graduated. And I was doing high frequency kind of equity trading at a company that you wouldn't know it. It doesn't exist anymore. I started at Lehman Brothers. First job out of undergrad, 2008.
Looking for alpha. You're trying to find some alpha.
That's right. Yeah. And, I had a front row seat to the great financial crisis.
Wow. Right. Yeah.
And after that, I kind of said,
Wait, you started in 2008?
I started a few years before.
I see. Yeah. So you had a little bit of the salad days before the lettuce wilted.
Yes, that's a much more pleasant analogy. It was such an eye-opening experience to recognize that the folks in and around the org, in and around the company, maybe are either not entirely forthright with the employees about what's going on, or
Right.
just don't know what's going on.
So you were at Lehman when the 2008 happened?
I was,
Wow.
trader.
Talk about a spin-off podcast waiting to happen. We got to go deep on that part of your backstory.
I'll take you out for a beer. We'll talk about it. But after it left, I remember I was trading bonds. I was actually trading equities. I was doing some capital asset arbitrage, managing a portfolio. And I remember when the algorithms were kind of trading for us, I remember talking to my mentors and managers, and I said, look, we don't know why we're buying or selling these things. What's the why?
Yeah.
And the answer was effectively, well, because we know that a pension fund or a retirement fund or a larger account is going into that stock, and we're going in ahead of time.
Right.
So it's effectively, front running grandma.
And this is way back. This is like the human in the loop conversation that we're still talking about to this day. This is back around algorithmic trading in 2008.
Yes. I mean, this is any kind of high frequency trading.
Yeah.
High frequency algorithmic proprietary trading. And I remember saying, look, I want to really understand why these stocks go up and down. So my mentor said, great, start a company.
Yeah.
I said, okay, great. 2008, I now have my opportunity.
Yeah.
I started 3 companies.
Yeah.
After 6 months, shut down the ones that weren't working. The one that worked actually was a school.
Yeah.
It was a company called Clean Edison. We grew to be the largest green jobs training company in the world.
Yeah.
Got acquired by
My former
company.
mothership, Kaplan. Yes, that's how we got to know each other. Absolutely.
That's right. So we go way back. Way back.
Yeah.
And then I had a career at IBM. At the Watson Education business unit, helped start up, which is applying AI in education with early language model, not GPT-3. This is
It's like Watson, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's when the models were called Bert and Ernie. And so we did some great work there, building tutors, which is fun to watch.
Jill Watson, right? That was the virtual TA who got a lot of press. I think she was a variant on Watson at Georgia State, if I remember right.
Jill Watson, one of my favorite applications, was unrelated to IBM. It was a professor that used IBM's API and endpoint and data to build his own tutor. And it got a lot of press and it worked really well.
That's kind of like a precursor of all the LLM wrappers that people are talking about today. And I'm not talking about LL Cool J rapper with a W. Some of the underlying tech, there is benefit. I was talking to Steve Shapiro on a recent show, and he's been in ed tech for the last 15, 20 years. And I feel like people who've been in the space longer have more interesting takes on where we are today. Cause you've kind of seen the tide come in and out a few times, and you can almost notice patterns that people who are almost overselling the upside of AI, or, even the folks who are more skeptical, betting don't pass at the craps table, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but it does seem like you've been in these spaces for quite some time. So that was sort of taking us through the teens, right?
Yeah. Had a lot of great fun at IBM. Probably the smartest people I've ever worked with were at the research labs up in
Yeah.
Yorktown.
Mhm.
And then I spent some time at Two Sigma. Asked me to start this business unit, which was meant to price catastrophe bonds and insurance risk.
Two Sigma, great name, by the way. Well
I know,
done.
right?
Who doesn't like a normal distribution? Who doesn't like standard deviations? You know?
Well, it's funny because at IBM, I spent so much time talking about the Two Sigma problem
Right.
with,
Tutoring.
with
Yeah.
different Two Sigma.
Right. And a different Bloom, not the Bloom taxonomy Bloom.
That's right. And then after that, I started this company, Subconscious AI, and my objective was staying in clean tech. I really wanted to understand why people were not mobilizing for climate change
Mm.
like it's effectively, three sort
This
of
is like Don't Look Up,
forces.
right? The movie.
Don't like how, yes, exactly.
Try to keep it pop culture for the listeners. You know how I roll. DiCaprio pointing at the screen. It's like a meme. Look out. I know it's an asteroid, but I think it was a metaphor, right? It was an allegory.
I think you might be conflating Don't Look Up and Once Upon a Time in LA. So anyway, so I started running experiments on why people don't mobilize for climate change. And,
Yeah.
I spent a little bit of money doing this. I discovered that some people think climate change is not real,
Yeah.
and therefore we can't do anything about it. Some people think climate change is real and it's too late, about a third.
Yeah.
And then only a third of people think climate change is real and we can do something about it.
Right.
So those that don't think it's real and think it's real and that it's too late are kind of working together.
Mm. So it's like a 2/3 to 1/3. That's not enough to activate.
Well, yeah. And so I realized we have to change people's minds. We have to message people in the right way. And
Yeah.
I wonder if I can run these experiments using language models.
Mhm.
This was about 2 years ago. And so
Right.
I started doing that and it started working.
Mhm.
And so just for kicks, I was kind of seeing if I could run other experiments with language models. And
Yeah.
I got in touch with a professor at Harvard who I've known since the IBM days and University of Chicago. And now we've replicated hundreds of experiments in psychology and sociology and economics.
And it's instead of using human subjects, you're using the LLMs to simulate how human subjects would respond to research questions.
That's exactly right. We've built a digital twin of society, we call it. We
Yeah.
built these agents that have the same motivations, effects, attitudes, perceptions as the general population, and we
Mhm.
survey them, these causal experiments, gold standard, randomized, controlled, blinded experiments,
Yeah.
to see if the reasons why the language models make decisions is the same as humans, and we find they're near indistinguishable.
Interesting. Well, because the knock is confabulation, but then it's not like humans don't confabulate or lie or give bad information. So in some ways, the inherent biases are reflective of the biases that we all actually have as humans.
Right.
Hmm.
People worry about the bias in the language models. We've found a way to kind of turn the bias into a product.
Right. And even quantify it to some extent. I know you kind of sample across different LLMs. Nate Silver got a lot of love for what he was doing at the 538. It's almost like you're doing that now with the LLMs rather than over indexing on any one of them. You're kind of surveying all the LLMs out there. And then I'm sure there's some proprietary modeling and work that you're doing with your own algorithms and your own cleaning up of the data. Any advice for folks? Our audience is probably mostly education, future of learning, future of work oriented. You've been getting your hands dirty with the actual LLMs that are out there and, really surveying all of them. Any high level advice or any tips for folks who are, starting to get their feet wet with this stuff?
Don't be shy. The barrier to entry for creating products, creating value for users has dropped precipitously.
Yeah.
The only thing I would kind of be wary of is making sure you're doing the right thing for the user.
Hmm.
And so I'll give you an example, right? I've heard this quote, about 20% of OpenAI's revenue is education revenue.
Yeah.
And the way people came to this assumption was in the summer, OpenAI's revenue drops by 20%. Right? Okay, fine. And so if you're using a language model to act as a one-on-one tutor, I can see learning accelerate. If you're using a language model to write your term paper, I can see learning decelerate.
Yeah. And this is where, I've mentioned to you and I've mentioned to my listeners, Ethan Malick's book, Co-Intelligence, is excellent. And it is talking a lot about almost the interaction model, the human factors, the 1-2 punch of like, what does the human do? What does the AI do? And how do you think about how the two should interplay? And that's where, as a human, there's some like metacognition, meta awareness of where do I fit and where do these agents and models work best. I imagine you spend a lot of time thinking about that.
We do. We do. What we found is tasks with a very, very high volume,
Hmm.
very high volume and kind of like low valence, low enjoyment.
Yeah, I've heard like boring, repetitive, and dirty for optimization, like automation,
Right.
the things that humans don't want to do. And it's mostly information work because the robots aren't going to get there for quite some time, to
Right.
kind of replace the work that we don't want humans to do, but is physical. And then it is interesting where one use case around education is like the research assistant. And that's something all of the big players are kind of releasing products that almost can serve as a research assistant. What's your read on that? Because you probably are benchmarking some of the stuff that you're doing against what the research assistants can do. And then you're also probably incorporating them when they're, when that same underlying model is available. What are your thoughts on AI as a research assistant?
Is that repetitive, boring, and dirty? I think it works great. And I really do like some of the AI for research use cases. We actually have an AI for research product for the purposes of economics, sociology, and psychology research.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I don't know if the word research is the right word for these products, right? Like a lot of people talk about how they're data scientists, but to be a scientist, you have to have a hypothesis and design and run an experiment.
Right.
And most data scientists are, and not most, many data scientists are making visualizations of data.
Yeah. It's almost like
Which is fine.
descriptive rather than inferential statistics.
Beautiful. And so with a lot of these like GPT researchers, it's descriptive and not inferential.
Mm-hmm.
These researchers aren't running experiments. They are collating data from a lot of different places.
Yeah, they're trying to understand things. They're perhaps trying to make inferences from descriptive statistics, but it's not like an actual experiment with a hypothesis that is testable, that is falsifiable. Shout out to, is that Stephen Popper? I think so. I don't know. I'll look it up. Our crack research staff will help. But I think it was also, for me, it's the mental model of should you engage with the GPT, the chat GPT technology set? And if you think of it the way a researcher might think of a research assistant, I've heard that as one frame, one mental
Yes.
model that actually works pretty well. Because the other thing
Very
I've
well.
heard, and I believe, is these AIs are forcing us to develop our executive function much better so that we can actually direct the activity. Although I know a lot of the cutting edge is allowing the agent more autonomy, more decision making, more ability to operate independent of a human. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. And I wonder about the magnitude of the effect and the cost of the effect. And what I mean by that is, that there are studies that have shown that spell check makes kids poorer spellers, that GPS hinders your ability to navigate.
I call this the training wheels problem, because when my 4-year-old was learning how to ride his bike, he was on the training wheels tooling around Brooklyn, living the dream. And then we took the training wheels off and he was like, screw that. I don't want to ride this bike anymore. Good news though, 2 years later, he's tooling around like a champ. So just the timing needed to be right. The scooter parenting tip, scooter is a nice bridge if your kid was training wheels as opposed to the balance bike. Balance bike's what you're supposed to do if you know what you're doing. But it's the training wheels problem. It's like if you start with the training wheels as opposed to the balance bike, you're up on the bike faster, you're having more fun getting around, but you're ultimately not really developing the balance that you need, which is why some of the unaided stuff, it's like Luke in Star Wars, like some point you gotta put the visor on and just use
Trust
the
your
force.
instincts. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
You got to develop those instincts.
Yes.
I think that's a great analogy. I don't use training wheels with my boys. They love riding bikes. But yes, it's exactly that. I think there are risks of over-reliance on AI. Honestly, I think we could shut off large language model development today,
Yeah.
and the economy would spend the next 20 years kind of integrating what we have today.
it's become much more of an engineering problem now. Like there are more problems that can be solved through engineering due to some of these breakthroughs. And it's like we're playing catch up on that front, even as the cutting edge of the technology moves forward. I do follow Gary Marcus and Benjamin Riley, Brian Merchant, other folks who are AI skeptics who are basically saying, the LLM bubble is in fact a bubble and that it's going to reach a point of diminishing returns. Arguably, we're already there in that GPT-5. We're kind of asymptotically approaching GPT-5. We're kind of getting close, but not quite there. And it's partly because the underlying technology, that there's certain limitations to the transformer technology. And, I'm hearing more people talk about going back to something more symbolic. You were at IBM, so I'm sure you're pretty fluent in all this. Any read on where you think this is going? Like what's next?
I believe in incentives. I think people will train to where the incentives are. One thing that concerns me a little bit about the way the language model development is going is the risk of emergent behaviors with these larger language models. In the climate world, we used to make these the kind of dark predictions. We would say, okay,
Yeah.
if there was a 1% chance of existential risk, if there's a 1% chance of infinite loss,
Yeah.
how much would you be willing to pay to
Mhm.
reduce that risk? And you should be
Mhm.
willing to pay infinite.
Right.
And these language models that are being developed, there's no theory on what will emerge, what behaviors will emerge. If you look on the Wikipedia page for P doom, the probability of doom,
Mhm.
I'm not quoted on there. The founding fathers of these LLMs are, and they're saying 50%, not
Right.
1%, 50%,
Yeah.
50, and they're still going in. So from an existential risk perspective, that kind of scares me.
Yeah.
From a benchmarking perspective and from an incentives perspective, if you have EQ and IQ,
Mhm.
uh,
Y-axis, X-axis for
this is
those
like this.
listening.
How do you think IQ and EQ correlate?
We talked about this before. I forget. Are they inversely correlated? Is that?
It's slightly inversely correlated. Yeah, it's a shotgun blast, but there's a slight negative.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the benchmarks for these LLMs, it's all on the IQ dimension.
Mm. Right.
Nobody is building EQ
Right.
benchmarks for these language models except us by
Right.
human EQ benchmarks.
Yeah.
And so everyone's kind of showing how high the IQ is of their language models, but no one's measuring or testing the EQ.
Right.
And when you do, you get some very concerning behaviors.
Right. Because they're a little more antisocial, right?
There are many issues. They can be antisocial. They can be deceptive and growing more deceptive. Some of them show this existential dread, which needs to be
Yeah.
kind of like programmed out of them. I mean, there's all kinds of.
Right. Personality disorders probably too, right? It's trained off of us. Come on.
They're just like us.
And you found some interesting tech ethics questions too. When you're doing a corollary to randomized controlled trial, there are human subjects factors that are typically go into that research, and you're finding corollaries to that doing this research with the LLMs.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. We had a client come to us, and at first they wanted to see if the language models could replicate behaviors under addiction. And they perform okay replicating addictive behaviors, but not not as well as non-clinical.
Make sure you lock your liquor cabinet when you're doing this type of research.
So then someone came to us and they said, well, we want to understand what causes harm to people. Mark Zuckerberg gets to stand in front of Congress and say that social media does not cause harm.
Right.
And of course he can say that because it's impossible to prove
Right.
anything causes harm, because to prove that something causes harm, you need to potentially expose the participants to harm. And that's unethical.
Some of the macro data around suicides among teens and Jonathan Haidt and the anxious generation, there is an awakening, I think, around something must have caused this. And it does seem to sync up with smartphones and social media to teens and adolescents.
100%. Every piece of data outside of running a randomized controlled trial, you can do dose response studies, you can do 3x3 studies, you can do natural experiments. Everything says that social media harms children. And if you look at the numbers, some numbers I've seen quoted is something like 500,000 extra young Americans under 25 have committed suicide in the last 20 years. Right? Which is the numbers are just astronomical.
Crazy orders of magnitude. Yeah.
Right. And so for someone to come up and say, oh, well, because you can't run a randomized controlled trial, you can't prove that something causes harm.
Right.
Someone can go and say, can you use LLMs to prove that
Mm.
this causes harm? We said, let's try and let's investigate. And in starting to think about this with the client, we set up an IRB.
IRB is the review board to like approve the ethics of research, particularly with human subjects, right?
Exactly. And ideally, you want to make sure that you're not harming the participants.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
First, do no harm. And so the earlier language models say, I don't have awareness. I don't have
Right.
any sort of a consciousness. So feel free. You have my permission. You have my consent.
Yeah.
And the newer models, some of them say, well, you have my permission, but because I have no free will, you do not have my consent. And now the models that are coming out in the last 6 months, they've started saying, you don't have my permission and you don't have my consent to run this study.
Right. And you wonder too, because you don't know behind the curtain how much is being moderated so that you can't use, like this use case could get shut down if they say these types of questions can't really be answered. And because none of these, very few of the models that we talk about are genuinely open, so you could
That's
actually
right.
understand what they're doing. That's one of the main cautions here too. Like using these LLMs, you almost need to go a level deeper, which I know you and team are doing at Subconscious to try to understand the inherent bias, understand like the nuance of which model and when for which types of context. It almost seems like there's a layer of expertise that needs to be applied to these problems. And, you're kind of operating in that space. We're getting a little closer to time. I'd love to continue this conversation because it is fascinating stuff. And I think people will eat it up like it's a real use case and you're doing kind of groundbreaking work. But, if you were to kind of synthesize the current state of play and give folks in the learning and future of work some takeaways or some suggestions, some advice, what might you offer folks?
I would say learn as much as you can about these models, stay as close as you can to the technology, and demand open, transparent, audits and data on how these things perform, on how they're trained, on how they make decisions, because it's really scary to think, hundreds of billions of dollars a year are being invested into putting these language models into decision-making roles at companies when nobody is giving them a psychopathy test, like any sort of basic checks.
Mm-hmm.
All our data is public. You can see how our language models perform. Like we have immigration studies that we perform, the European models.
And we'll include links, but this is subconscious.ai is the website.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting also. I think you'd certainly opened up my thinking about ways in which these LLMs could be leveraged against big problems, including those of like self-harm and substance abuse. I've always thought in the past about the environmental problem. And it's interesting that you've been sort of exploring that space as well, where it does seem like these exponential technologies, while they do have high like doom quotients, they also are powerful enough that they could perhaps avert catastrophes if pointed in the right directions. It's sort of a mixed bag nowadays. And it's almost like you need more folks thinking about pro-social applications of the emerging technology.
The pro-social problem is kind of really where I want to take this business, is measuring not only which products people prefer, but also what sometimes they're called non-market goods, what externalities people prefer.
It makes me think also of like impact investing, and it's like the intersection between impact investing and AI. It does almost seem like perhaps a little bit bubble resistant. The other thing that we didn't touch on, DeepSeek came out recently, and it kind of was a splash of cold water for ChatGPT and OpenAI and others in terms of let's just continue to build bigger data centers and throw more and more capital at compute. In some ways, it was a wake-up call around innovation models. There's different economics and culture in China that allow DeepSeek, and it's not all rosy over there, but it was a bit of a wake-up call around some of the root economics and perhaps the economic impact of AI. Wearing that hat, any, commentary, any thoughts on the relationship between these models and environmental outcomes?
From an economics perspective, I think that the hardware layer, like the language models investing in the training of these models,
Yeah.
wildly overinvested and wildly overvalued. I don't think
Yeah.
people realize how cheap, or actually, I can't say cheap, how inexpensive it is to run these models.
Yeah.
And Sam Altman is saying that by 2030, we'll be able to have the world's education, the world's, effective economic output being powered out of a single data center.
Yeah.
Okay, why are you building 500 data centers?
Right.
We used to joke in education, if we paused society today for 7 years and we gave everyone in the country a PhD in the topic of their choice, would
Yeah.
that reduce unemployment?
Probably not. I know a lot of unemployed PhDs. Yeah.
Well, there's going to be a lot of unemployed PhDs in data centers. But that's kind of the question. What do you do when the cost of this work goes to zero? I mean, you're asking for advice earlier. I said, learn about these models. I would also say, imagine a world where any job behind a screen can be done for zero cost. And I would say, don't trust anything you see on social media. Touch people, go out and touch grass, be in the real world. That can't be, manipulated.
Yeah. It's hard to twin too. Even the embodied intelligence and, the shared human experiences, like those are things that are hardest to replicate and to simulate, although it's all coming. The technology is evolving very quickly, but it's interesting to look at these things a little bit more critically. And I appreciate that that's something that you've been able to bring.
That is not what makes people happy, right? The digital experiences do not bring joy.
Right.
Right? What brings joy? Social connection.
Yeah.
Community, life, liberty, happiness. None of these things,
right,
are going to be found behind a screen.
Yeah. Book recommendation. I just finished Chris Hayes's book, Siren's Call, which is about the attention economy and a lot of what we're talking about, where, a lot of the screen mediated aspects of the way we pay attention and the way we consume media are damaging and kind of resulting in some of the political problems that we're facing. And the more you can kind of control your attention, Siren's Call, he takes it back to, Jason, is it Jason tying himself to the mast? Achilles tying himself to the mast and putting wax in his ears to avoid the siren's call. Odysseus. There you go. Thank you. My fact checking team. Closing thoughts, Avi. It's been wonderful. I'd love to have you back, but any takeaways, final thoughts for our listeners?
Spend your time away from screens, away from the AI. Spend as much time away from the AI as possible, and at the same time, learn as much as you can about it.
Yeah. It's one of those both ends. You got to both be careful about your time, but also don't stay away, because it really is the future. Speaking of the future, subconscious.ai will include links to doing some amazing work there. Avi Yashchin, the founder of Subconscious AI, thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Thank you, Michael. It's a privilege.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe, write us a review, tell your friends. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.